1777 was a turning point. Everyone knew General Howe's next target was Philadelphia, the de facto capital of the colonies where the Continental Congress met. Howe could have marched straight from New Jersey into Philly, but decided to transport his men by ship to the Chesapeake Bay instead, where they would then have to march 50 miles to attack the city from the south. It was a bizarre decision. To protect Philadelphia, Washington positioned his troops at Brandywine Creek and got thrashed, being forced to retreat into Pennsylvania. The Continental Congress evacuated, ending up in the city of York. Howe entered Philadelphia, where Loyalist supporters came out to celebrate. He wrote to the king to inform him of his latest success. But that success looked better on paper than in reality. The Continental Congress still conducted business. Washington's men were still in good spirits. Men from Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire fought side by side. They started thinking of themselves not as British citizens or citizens of Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, or New Hampshire, but as American citizens. They were forming a new national identity. But they still needed to win the war, which would require more than just a positive attitude. They needed battlefield victories. Would 1777 be their year? The Continental Congress, now meeting in the city of York, had to answer the question that so many people in new relationships must ask. What are we? Like, are we 13 different countries, or are we like in a relationship? Are we one country? They came up with an answer: the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. The title says it all. Perpetual Union meant all 13 were together. But together in what? If they were deciding to work together on their own, they certainly weren't listening to Britain anymore. The word state implies that each state ruled over themselves. They exercised what's called sovereignty over themselves, sort of like 13 separate countries. States would send representatives to Congress, where each state got one vote. They voted on things like how many troops or how much money George Washington needed. They voted on how to deal with foreign countries like France. And it took 9 of 13 votes in Congress to approve of any decision, a supermajority. If Congress did approve of raising more money or troops, they could only ask the states to contribute. They couldn't tax the states, couldn't draft men into the army, and couldn't really enforce any of their decisions. This is why it was called the Articles of Confederation. A confederation is more like an alliance than a government. Each state had their own governments. They had no desire to build some giant super government that ruled over all 13 of them. In fact, that's what they were fighting against Britain for. Their hatred of Britain united them. But what would happen to this confederation after war with Britain ended? Only time would tell. Meanwhile, another British general named John Burgoyne was on the move. He had a plan to lead an army from Canada into upstate New York to retake Fort Ticonderoga, which the British had lost in 1775. From there, he would send one group of soldiers west to round up Native American allies, while he led an army south to take the city of Albany. At Albany, he would then be joined by his new Native American allies, and they'd all continue further south in the direction of New York City. He hoped this would cause George Washington to leave the Philadelphia area to defend New York, at which point General Howe would send troops north to snare Washington in a north-south trap between himself and Burgoyne. At the very least, Burgoyne would gain control of New York State, severing the neck of the American snake for good. New England wouldn't be able to send men into the war, and other states wouldn't be able to send food and money to New England. Before leaving Britain, Burgoyne made a bet that he would have the war won by Christmas Day. His plan started out well enough. When he got to Fort Ticonderoga, he was amazed to find that the Americans had left the high ground near the fort, called Mount Defiance, unprotected. He stationed artillery on Mount Defiance and then drove the Americans out of the fort. Ticonderoga was now his. Then, he sent Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger west into upstate New York to round up Native American allies. St. Ledger recruited a group of Iroquois natives called the Haudenosaunee, but most of them returned home after their first battle. When St. Ledger rejoined Burgoyne, Burgoyne was disappointed by how few Native Americans he had brought with him. But the disappointments were just beginning. General Howe wrote him from Philadelphia that he intended to focus on Philadelphia. After all, George Washington was in the area. and he was gonna find him. He told Burgoyne not to hold his breath waiting for him, but Howe was then replaced by British General Henry Clinton, who offered to send an army of 2,000 men north to help Burgoyne. Burgoyne responded, "Bro, 2,000 men? Why don't you just get me an army from Timu? It would be just as good." Burgoyne was on his own, and yet he was still optimistic. He continued with his plan to march towards Albany. It was a bizarre decision. He could have floated his way to Albany by boat, but for some reason, he chose to march his men and supplies through thick New York woods instead. He didn't do himself any favors by dragging his own luxury items with him, which required several slow-moving horses. The Americans didn't do him any favors either, by cutting down trees so that Burgoyne had to roll logs out of his way every few feet. While his men slowly plodded through the woods, Americans had time to prepare. And the Americans prepared. Newspapers reported that Burgoyne's Native American allies had murdered the wife of a loyalist who was helping Burgoyne. Americans took this as proof that Native Americans were in the area killing white women, no matter which side of the war they were on. Much like American Southerners believed a British victory would bring slave revolts, American Northerners believed the British victory would bring Native American attacks. Many American men who didn't see any reason to join the Patriot cause before certainly had reason now. Their nightmares seemed to be coming true when a force of Germans and Native Americans showed up on John Green's farm in upstate New York, right over the border from Bennington, Vermont. Burgoyne had sent them there to take food and supplies. American militia came from far and wide to defend Bennington from the invaders, who were driven away back to the safety of Burgoyne's army. By sending his German and Native American allies onto New England's doorstep, he had stirred up a hornet's nest. A bunch of new American recruits were convinced that they needed to defend their homes. Nevertheless, Burgoyne continued to press towards Albany. His men were relieved to see the ends of the woods in sight. A clear area lay ahead at Freeman's farm. They heard turkey calls close by, and then, all of a sudden, Americans popped out from behind trees and bushes. Muzzles flashed from every direction. A bullet tore through Burgoyne's hat, causing him to laugh. The turkey calls continued to ring out from the trees. These weren't turkeys at all. It was American Commander Captain Daniel Morgan communicating with his men. Burgoyne was surrounded by a shadowy enemy he could not see. He couldn't beat his drums and send his professional troops on a heroic march to take control of the battlefield. He couldn't use artillery to sweep his enemies from the battlefield. Still, he refused to retreat. He was pinning his hopes on General Clinton sending those 2,000 troops north. That Timu army was now his only hope. Meanwhile, more Americans continued to arrive. Benedict Arnold, the man who had helped capture Fort Ticonderoga at the start of the war, arrived to help Captain Morgan. He caught a bullet to the leg for his troubles, knocking him out of action for a long time. Nevertheless, the Americans kept coming. Burgoyne had to pull his army back, ending up on the high ground around a place called Saratoga. From the heights of Saratoga, he could see Americans swarming from every direction. It looked like a replay of the Battle of Concord from the early days of the war, when men from all around New England rushed out to defend their country. His men started looking to the only escape route they had left, Fort Ticonderoga. Burgoyne figured he could pull back to the fort to recover and maybe try his plan again later, but then the Americans blocked him from even that escape route. Burgoyne was left with no choice. On October 17th, he surrendered his army to the Americans. The man who bet he would win the war by Christmas didn't even make it to Halloween. It was the biggest American victory of the war so far. It wasn't a moral victory like Trenton or Princeton. It was a decisive tactical victory. This was great news for the Americans and the French. The French had been watching this little soap opera play out between Britain and her colonies with amusement. They were still salty about losing the French and Indian War, and they wanted revenge. What better way than by helping the 13 colonies gain independence? In 1776, France and Spain established a mysterious company called Hortoles et Cie, to whom they sold weapons. The company then sold those weapons to the Americans. The vast majority of gunpowder Americans used came from Hortoles et Cie. since French gunpowder had the reputation as the best available. By funneling weapons through the company, France and Spain could always publicly deny that they were helping the Americans, which would prevent Britain from declaring war on them. Plus, France didn't want to put their own men and ships into the war. If America lost, then France would be next on Britain's hit list. But the Battle of Saratoga changed everything. The French now saw that the Americans could stand on their own. Both them and Spain promised to send men and ships. Britain still had the biggest navy, but they didn't have more ships than France and Spain combined. This gave America something they had been missing: sea power, a way to challenge Britain's control of the water. Meanwhile, George Washington and his men camped out for the winter in a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. In February 1778, a German man arrived to volunteer his services to General Washington. He told him he was a decorated war strategist back in Germany, which was a lie. But he looked like one, and he had riz, so Washington chose to believe him. His name was Baron von Steuben. Over the next few weeks, the Baron trained Americans in how to march, how to hold a gun, how to use a bayonet, how to reform their ranks after they got broken up. He was like a coach teaching the basics, things Americans never properly learned. By the end of the winter, Washington's men looked and acted like a proper army. They would get their chance soon enough to show off their new skills. General Clinton, who had taken over from General Howe, was told to pull his men out of Philadelphia and head back to New York City. Washington heard that the British were leaving through New Jersey. He couldn't pass up the chance to hit them. He sent General Charles Lee, recently released from being a prisoner of war, to attack the British at Monmouth Courthouse as they marched towards New York. It was a juicy opportunity. The British were stretched out over several miles, while the Americans were all together. Washington could send his army crashing like a wrecking ball through the thin British lines. But Charles Lee was kind of a hater. He was second in command to Washington, but wanted to take his place. He tried to turn people against Washington by spilling the most vicious tea about him. When Washington sent him to attack the British at Monmouth Courthouse, he took his sweet-ass time, allowing most of the British army to get across the Hudson River to New York City. And even when he did attack, the orders he gave his men were confusing. He did nothing to unconfuse them. It was clear he was trying to sabotage the entire operation to make Washington look bad. And just as it looked like all hope was lost, Washington came out of nowhere and took control of the battlefield. The Americans did some damage, but not nearly what they could have done if Lee didn't screw it up. The British eventually slipped into New York. This was the last time the two main armies fought face to face. The battle had proved that Baron von Steuben's drilling had worked. Americans looked more confident, more handy with their guns, and less confused on the battlefield, despite Charles Lee's orders. They looked like a functioning army. It also proved that Charles Lee was such a hater, he was willing to risk losing the war just to make Washington look bad. He ended up being court-martialed or brought up on charges in military court. George Washington had secured his place as commander. No hater was going to knock him off his perch now. His crew of admirers supported him to the end, including his young protege, Alexander Hamilton, and the Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette. 1777 brought America victories. It brought them allies. It brought them unity and a new sense of confidence. But victory was still a long way away.